Sometimes, I wonder if the food we order really comes from where we think it does. The soft touch of the delivery person on the doorbell is like a grim warning. Something may not be right. As night falls over the city of New Orleans, shadows stretch and the air becomes thick with a mystery few would dare to explore. Life in the vibrant streets hides deep secrets, and what seems like a simple food delivery can turn into a nightmare. On that fateful night, I was alone in my small apartment in the French Quarter, surrounded by walls that whispered stories of love and loss. The smell of the jambalaya I had ordered danced in the air, promising comfort amidst the solitude. But as the clock ticked on, an unease overtook me. The delivery person was late. I looked out the window and saw the full moon rising, bathing the city in a spectral glow. The music of street musicians echoed in the distance, but in my heart, there was a feeling that something was about to happen. When I finally heard footsteps approaching, my heart raced. The door opened, and before me stood a man I didn't recognize, his vacant gaze and grim expression unsettling. He handed me the food box with a brusque gesture, and before I could thank him, he turned and vanished into the night. The aroma of the food filled the air, but something was wrong. As I opened the box, I found not only the dinner I had ordered, but a scrawled note in shaky handwriting. "Don't eat. What comes back is not what you ordered." A wave of terror washed over me. What did this mean? I looked out the window again, hoping to see the delivery person, but instead, I saw a hooded figure moving away, disappearing into the shadows. Fear began to seep into my mind, and the food, once appetizing, now felt like a trap. I decided to investigate. The French Quarter, normally vibrant, now felt like a labyrinth of mystery. I walked to the spot where the delivery person had left my food. The street was deserted, lit only by the dim light of street lamps. I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone, just the sound of the breeze and the distant echo of music that seemed to be fading away. What would I find if I followed the path back? The human mind is a strange thing. Curiosity can be as powerful as fear. I needed to know. The note burned in my hand, as if it were alive, and the idea that something supernatural was involved consumed me. I followed the delivery person's trail, diving into the dark streets, and soon found myself in a narrow alley where the moonlight could not reach. The air was heavy, and darkness seemed to close in around me. Then, I heard a whisper, a distant cry, as if someone were calling for help. My heart raced, and I moved forward, drawn by the voice that seemed to echo from another world. At the end of the alley, I found an old, creaking door. I pushed it open hesitantly, and upon entering, I was greeted by a scene that defied logic. The space was a mix of an abandoned restaurant and a macabre altar, with tables covered in melted candles and broken dishes. In the center sat the delivery person, now wearing a disturbing smile. "You came," he said, his voice resonating like an echo from somewhere deep. "Have you wondered what happens to those who order food here?" In that moment, I realized I was face to face with an entity that fed on fear and distrust. Each delivery was an invitation to something more sinister, a way to lure curious souls into a banquet of horrors. "Everything you desire can be yours," he continued, "but the price is steep. What you see here is not just food. It is the deepest desires you never dared to ask for." The sense of imminent danger overwhelmed me. What had I brought with me? The food? The curiosity? I needed to get out of there. But as I tried to retreat, I realized the path was closing in, as if the house itself were alive, forming barriers to keep me trapped. In a last effort, I shouted, "What do you want from me?" My tone of desperation seemed to echo off the walls, and the delivery person's laughter morphed into a howl, filling the space with a sense of oppression. His response was a whisper, like a wind passing through the leaves of trees. "I want you to choose. What do you truly desire?" In that moment, I understood that the true choice lay before me: to give in to curiosity and dark desires, or to fight to escape this nightmare. With a surge of adrenaline, I ran toward the exit, feeling the presence of the delivery person following me, his laughter echoing like a remnant of what could have been. Finally, I reached the door and burst outside, breathing in the fresh night air, now filled with new possibilities. The city lights shone brightly, and the music of the street musicians sounded clearer than ever. I knew that the food I had ordered had led me to a place where few would return. But with the experience, I learned that the true meal comes from the security of our choices and the courage to face the unknown. That night, as the full moon illuminated the city, I left behind not just a plate of food, but a part of myself that would never return. Whatever had happened during that delivery, I knew there would always be a price to pay for answering the calls of curiosity, and what didn't kill me definitely made me wiser. The cool night air wrapped around me like a comforting embrace, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something had changed forever. The music still echoed through the streets, but the rhythm now felt like a drumbeat, pulsing in a tempo of fear. What had I discovered in that abandoned house? The delivery man, the message, the choice I hadn't made, yet it echoed in my mind. With adrenaline still coursing through my veins, I decided that I couldn't simply ignore what had happened. Whatever that man was, he wasn't just a delivery person. He was a doorway to something much deeper, and I needed to understand what was happening. Curiosity, that flame that had guided me this far, would not extinguish so easily. I walked quickly along the cobblestone streets, trying to focus on any clue that might lead me back to that entity and the mystery surrounding it. The French Quarter, usually vibrant, now seemed draped in a shroud of fog, as if the city were guarding secrets it didn't want to share. That's when I spotted a woman with disheveled hair, sitting on the sidewalk, with a distant look in her eyes. She held a plastic cup with remnants of a drink, and the expression on her face was that of someone who had seen things she shouldn't have. As I approached, I realized she had an air of wisdom, as if she carried the burdens of past experiences. "Did you see the delivery man?" I asked, hesitating. The woman looked up, and her eyes seemed to shine with hidden knowledge. "You shouldn't have ordered food that night," she said, her voice hoarse. "The city has its rules, and one of them is that certain deliveries come with a price. You felt it, didn't you? His presence." I don't know what happened," I replied, confused. "But he told me he wanted me to choose." "What does that mean?" She let out a bitter laugh. "It means you're in danger. He feeds on desire, and once you summon him, he won't leave easily. Many have disappeared after an encounter with him." Fear wrapped around me once more. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "Those who ask for something they cannot have. Those who let curiosity lead them," she explained, struggling to get to her feet. "You need to find the truth before it's too late. He always leaves clues, but they can lead to dark places." What she said resonated within me like a warning bell. The idea that there were others who had faced the same entity and hadn't returned unsettled me. I needed help, and this woman, despite her state, was the only one who seemed to understand what was happening. "Can you help me?" I asked, hopeful. She hesitated, looking at the shadows moving around me. "What you seek may not be what you desire, but if you are determined, follow the clues. Go to Café du Monde. Sometimes, when the moon is full, souls gather there." With those words echoing in my mind, I decided I had no other choice. Café du Monde, famous for its beignets and café au lait, was a place where people congregated. But that night, I knew it was much more than just a cafe. As I made my way there, the city seemed to transform. The streetlights flickered, and the music that had once been joyful now sounded like a lament. What would I find at the cafe? Could it be that other souls, like that woman's, were also trying to escape the same fate as mine? Upon arriving at the cafe, I noticed a crowd gathered, but a strange sensation hung in the air. People whispered to each other, and their faces were pale, as if they had emerged from a nightmare. In the center of the cafe, a group of people sat around a table, and when their gazes met mine, I realized they were aware of something I did not know. A woman with dark hair and an intense expression stood up. "Did you also receive a delivery?" she asked, her voice heavy with anxiety. "Yes," I replied, trying to stay calm. "What happened to you?" She looked around, as if fearing someone was listening. "He comes after us, always. What did you see in the house? What did he say?" I recounted what had happened, and as I spoke, I noticed others at the table listening intently. The woman continued, "He feeds on our fears and desires. We need to unite if we want to confront him. I've seen people disappear, and every time one of them leaves, a new desire is fed." Her words hit me like a wave. The delivery man wasn't just a messenger. He was a predator who fed on our weaknesses. And what I had felt when I opened that food box was not just fear, but a hunger for something I could not understand. "We need to find a way to break this cycle," someone interjected. "If he is here, it means we can lure him away from us." Determined to face this challenge, I looked at the woman who had spoken. "How do we do that?" "He feeds on our weaknesses, but we can use that against him. We need to find the desires he cannot fulfill. If we can confront him with something he cannot consume, perhaps we can free those he has imprisoned," she explained. Deep within me, something began to stir. I had to confront the delivery man, not just for myself, but for all those being drawn into this nightmare. With the support of this group, I could uncover the truth behind that cursed delivery. The night was still young, and I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew the battle was just beginning. Whatever lurked in the shadows of the city, I was determined to face it, not only in search of answers, but to rescue the lost souls, just like me. The atmosphere in Café du Monde grew increasingly oppressive as the conversation progressed. The faces around me reflected a mix of fear and determination, but there was also a palpable sense of despair. As we discussed how to confront the delivery man, the cafe lights began to flicker, as if the city itself were stirring in response to our presence. The smell of beignet and coffee mingled with sweat and anxiety, creating an almost unbearable atmosphere. The dark-haired woman, who seemed to be the leader of that small group, began to devise a plan. "We need to find out what the delivery man really was. He feeds on our weaknesses. If we can understand that, maybe we can lure him in and disarm him." Her words echoed in my mind, but I felt increasingly lost. The fears and desires I carried were like shadows threatening to consume me. "What if he can't be disarmed?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What if he just devours us faster?" No one answered. The silence was broken only by the sound of coffee being served and the nervous murmurs around us. More and more, I felt like an intruder in this group, as if the responsibility of facing this entity weighed heavily on me. Something inside me stirred, a mix of fear and determination. I knew I had to confront this, but the thought of facing the delivery man left me paralyzed. What happened next was a whirlwind of emotions. One of the people at the table, a weary-looking man, began to talk about his own encounters with the delivery man. He appeared to me in a dream. I was in a dark room, and he offered me everything I ever wanted. But when I accepted, everything changed. I lost my family, my job. He consumes people's lives. His words were like daggers, and the intensity of his pain hit me hard. I didn't want to believe it could end like this. But a part of me knew that the delivery man was not an ordinary entity. What if he's connected to something deeper? I asked, trying to muster courage. What if he's a part of ourselves, a projection of our fears? My words were met with perplexed looks. The man who spoke before shook his head. That may be true. He feeds on what exists within us. If we can expose our fears and desires, maybe we can control the situation. The idea left me restless. What did I really fear? What did I desire? The answer seemed to hide in the shadows of my mind. Determined to unravel these mysteries, I suggested that each of us share our innermost fears. The group hesitated, but the dark-haired woman finally agreed. Maybe this is the only way for us to unite and confront him. We began to share our stories. The man spoke of the loneliness he felt after losing his family. A woman next to me revealed her fear of never being enough, of failing at everything she tried. Each account was like a stab, and as the words were spoken, the atmosphere seemed to grow denser, as if we were attracting the delivery man's attention. I hesitated before sharing my own story. I didn't want to expose my weaknesses, but I knew I had to. I fear never being loved, of being forgotten. The words came out as a whisper, but the intensity of what I felt was overwhelming. I looked at the faces around me and saw that they resonated with me, sharing the same pain. At that moment, a wave of cold swept through the cafe. The lights began to flicker more rapidly, and a collective murmur spread among us. I looked at the door, and in a fluid motion, a tall, dark figure entered the cafe. The delivery man was there, his presence palpable, like a storm about to break. The air grew heavy, and the music playing in the background warped, turning into an unsettling sound. The delivery man looked at us with eyes that seemed to see through our souls. "You called for me," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. "Each of you has a desire that I can fulfill, but the price is always high." Fear took hold of me, and I felt my heart race. The group drew together, but his presence seemed to divide us. One by one, each desire he mentioned became a threat. The man who had spoken about his family began to tremble, and the woman next to me covered her face as if she were about to break down. "What do you want from us?" I asked, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. His response was a wicked smile, and I realized he fed on our fear, our hesitation. "I want you to make a choice. Accept what I offer and live in your desires, or refuse and face the pain it brings. But remember, the pain never disappears. It just transforms." The tension rose, and I knew this was the decisive moment. We needed to unite, to find the courage within us, but doubt and fear threatened to tear us apart. What did I truly desire? The answer was a double-edged sword, a desire that could save me or condemn me. As the situation intensified, I realized that the true conflict was not just against the delivery man, but against ourselves. We needed to confront our own desires and fears, and that could be more terrifying than any supernatural entity. Whatever happened next, I knew the battle was just beginning, and as terrifying as it was, I was determined to fight. What I didn't expect was that, while the delivery person spoke, a wave of energy coursed through the environment. It was as if the coffee itself was writhing, the walls pulsing to the rhythm of our fear. The shadowy figure in front of us smiled, and in that smile, I perceived something more. A flash of familiarity. A distant, suffocating memory began to emerge from the fog of my mind. "You," I murmured, my heart racing as I made the connection. The delivery person was not just an entity feeding off our desires. He was someone I knew, someone who had left my life long ago. His face twisted into a grim recognition, and the atmosphere around us grew even heavier. "Ah, you remember?" he said, his voice now laced with a tone of satisfaction. "I am what you left behind, what you couldn't face, and now I am here to reclaim what is mine." The group around me seemed as lost as I was, but I knew that, at that moment, everything had changed. The delivery person was not just a personification of our fears. He was a manifestation of something much more personal and profound. He was the reflection of my weaknesses, my regrets, He was the representation of everything I had tried to hide. "You can't control us," I said, my voice now carrying a new determination. "You are our fear, and we will not let you win." But he only laughed, a low, disturbing sound, as if he were enjoying my bravado. "You still don't understand. I am part of you, and like you, everyone here has something to lose. What I offer is freedom from your own torment. Accept it, and I will give you what you desire." The lights in the cafe began to flicker frantically, and I realized that the delivery person was not only affecting us, but the reality around us. The space seemed to warp, the tables moving as if they were waves in a stormy sea. The cafe, once a refuge, was becoming a prison, and I knew that if we did not act quickly, we would be consumed. "Fight him," I shouted to the group, trying to muster the courage that lay in everyone's words. "We are stronger together than he is alone. We need to face our fears, not run from them." But instead of uniting, the others began to drift away, one by one, ensnared by the delivery person's promises. The man who had shared his pain about loneliness looked at me, his eyes filled with despair. "But what if we accept? What if this frees us? Freedom at what cost?" I shouted, but the struggle was internal, and I knew I could not save them. The delivery person was feeding off their doubts, their weaknesses. He was an emotional parasite, and the more they hesitated, the stronger he became. Then, something unexpected happened. As the delivery person focused on seducing the others, one of the beignets on the table began to glow with a strange light. I looked at it, perplexed, and saw that the light emanated from the mixture of sugar and dough, as if it were a beacon in the darkness. The sweet smell seemed to amplify the feeling of hope I had lost. This is a sign," I shouted, pointing to the table. "The coffee, the food, they are not just objects. They are symbols of who we truly are. If we can tune into this, maybe we can defeat him." The dark-haired woman, who until then seemed lost, looked at me with a new spark of determination. "What if we used our fears against him? If our stories, our pains, are the key?" With the delivery person distracted, I began to pick up the beignet one by one and offer them to the group. "Each bite is a step toward facing our fears. Let's turn them into something we can control." Reluctantly, they began to accept, and one by one, they started to eat. The environment began to change, the energy reversing. The cafe, which had been oppressive, now pulsed with new life. The light began to shine more brightly, as if we were invoking a greater force. "You can't do this," the delivery person screamed, his form beginning to distort and lose consistency. "I am what you fear." "No, you are what we left behind," I said, "and now we will free ourselves." With each bite, each story shared, his power diminished. The atmosphere became lighter, and I could see the struggle on the faces of the others. They were beginning to realize that their fears were not invincible. The light from the cafe intensified, and in a climax of energy, the delivery person screamed, his form fading into a cloud of shadows. The moment he disappeared, the cafe returned to normal, the lights stabilized, and the smell of coffee and beignet filled the air. I looked around and saw that the group, now united, was stronger. The delivery person had been defeated, but the battle was far from over. There was more within us that we needed to face, and I knew this experience was not the end, but the beginning of a new journey. The desire to be loved, to be seen, to be recognized, all of that was still present, but now there was a new hope. The delivery person might have gone away, but the lessons we learned and the bonds we created remained. We were together, and together we could face anything that lay ahead. The cafe environment was changing, and I felt it in my skin. The walls, once oppressive, now seemed to vibrate with a new energy, and the aroma of beignet and coffee mixed with the fear that still hung in the air. As I observed the others, I realized that the victory over the deliverer was not absolute. It was merely a battle in an internal war that we were all still fighting. With a deep sigh, I knew I needed to act. The deliverer might have been defeated, but his words echoed in my mind. He was what I had left behind, and as I looked at the faces of the others, I realized that each of them also carried their own shadows. The idea that we were stronger together comforted me, but doubt still rooted itself in me like a weed. "We need to unite," I said, trying to gather the confidence that still remained. "But we can't ignore what happened. The deliverer may have left, but he left a mark. We must confront our own fears and insecurities, or he might return in an even more threatening form." The dark-haired woman, now with a renewed glimmer in her eyes, nodded. "You're right. What he said about freedom, it was a trap. But what if he's not the only one? What if there are others like him?" The question hit her with the force of a punch, and I found myself paralyzed as well. What else could exist in the shadows? What if what we faced was only a fraction of what we were really about to confront? A chill ran down my spine. We need to investigate, discover the truth behind the deliverer and what he represents, I said, feeling the urgency grow within me. If he is a manifestation of our fears, maybe we can find clues in our own stories. The idea of digging into my memories made me anxious, but there was no turning back. The group began discussing their stories, sharing moments of pain and regret. Each account seemed to bring forth a new layer of understanding about what we had faced, but it also made it clear that what was coming would be even more challenging. As we talked, something inside me stirred. New memories began to emerge, fragments of a past I had tried to bury. In that cafe, amidst laughter and tears, I realized that my own story was intertwined with the deliverer. I had lost important people in my life, and instead of facing the pain, I had fled from it. The idea that the deliverer was a reflection of my own failures unsettled me. Two men at the table next to us began discussing an ancient myth of the city, a legend that spoke of creatures that fed on people's despair. Their words penetrated my mind like sharp blades. These creatures are not just stories. They exist, and if we don't confront what we truly fear, they may manifest again. The reality of the situation began to intensify, and I could not ignore the connection. The deliverer, he wasn't just a lost spirit. He is part of something bigger, something much darker, I said, my voice trembling with the gravity of the revelation. If this myth is true, we need to figure out how to defeat him before he returns. The faces around me showed concern, and I sensed that the idea of facing not just the deliverer, but also a possible dark force, was beginning to create fissures in the trust we had built. Doubts began to resurface, and I knew that, for each of them, the idea of confronting their fears was terrifying. "But what if we can't?" one of the men asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What if this force is greater than us? What if the deliverer comes back, stronger than before?" The question hung in the air, and I felt the weight of uncertainty. What I had proposed, confronting our fears and finding the truth, now seemed like an even greater burden. The fear I had tried to combat transformed into a shadow that threatened to engulf everything around us. "We need to find a way to strengthen ourselves," I said, trying to maintain control. If the deliverer was a representation of what we left behind, then we can only rid ourselves of him by facing those parts of ourselves. We need to figure out how this connects to the legend. That's when an idea began to form in my mind. What if we made a pact, a commitment to face our shadows together, to not let them dominate us again? Each of us can bring something from our past and turn it into a strength, a power we can use against him. The reaction was mixed. Some people seemed encouraged, while others hesitated, fearful of what this would mean. But determination began to shine in their eyes, and I realized that, although fear was still present, There was a new chance to face it. As we began to discuss what this would mean, a sudden crash cut through the air, silencing everyone. The cafe lights began to flicker again, and the atmosphere, once vibrant, turned dark. I looked at the group, and the reality that we might be about to face the deliverer once more solidified in my mind. The shadows began to stir, and a distorted laugh echoed through the room, louder and more sinister than before. The deliverer had returned, and this time he seemed more powerful, more real. And I realized that the fight was just beginning. The cafe atmosphere was becoming increasingly oppressive. The nervous laughter of others turned into anxious whispers, and the flickering light seemed to dance with the shadows, as if preparing for a macabre spectacle. The deliverer had returned, and his spirit, once just a latent threat, was now a palpable force, a presence that carried with it the promise of pain and despair. The distorted laughter echoed in my mind, and I found myself frozen, my eyes fixated on the door, where the hooded figure had appeared, its presence expanding like a black cloud. The smell of coffee was suddenly overshadowed by a stench of decay, and the feeling that we were cornered intensified. What I had proposed, to join forces against our fears, now seemed like a foolish idea in light of the reality we were about to face. "Stay together," I said, trying to gather my voice amid the internal chaos unfolding in my mind. Fear threatened to swallow me whole, but I knew I couldn't let it take over. We can't let ourselves be divided. But the memories emerging in my mind were heavy. The deliverer was not just a manifestation of all our fears. He was a symbol of my own guilt, of the people I had left behind, of the opportunities one had lost. Every step I took toward the fight felt like a denial of the pain I had buried. The idea of confronting what I truly felt left me in a state of emotional paralysis. As the group tried to reorganize, I noticed the tension growing. The faces that had once been resolute now showed signs of doubt. The dark-haired woman, who had seemed so strong before, now hesitated, her expression reflecting the same terror that consumed me. "What if he destroys us?" Her voice trembled. "What if we can't face this?" The question echoed in my mind. What if we couldn't? What if everything we tried was in vain? What did I have to offer? The anger and sadness inside me were like a whirlwind, and the thought that others depended on me only increased my anguish. But then, amid the despair, something within me stirred. I remembered the pact I had suggested. We needed to find strength in our stories, in our weaknesses. "We can't let him dominate our minds," I said, the urgency in my voice rising. "We need to face this together. Each of us has a role to play." The deliverer advanced, his figure twisting in a grotesque dance. He seemed to feed off our fear, each of his movements an attempt to divide us. I felt the atmosphere around us grow heavier, as if the walls of the cafe were closing in. "Remember what you lost," he murmured, his voice a chilling whisper. "Remember what you will never be." His words pierced me like sharp knives, and I almost succumbed to despair. But as I looked at the others, I saw that they were fighting too. Each one carried their own scars, and perhaps, just perhaps, this shared pain could unite us. "Let's confront him," I shouted, my voice cutting through the heavy air. "Let's turn our pain into power." Voices began to rise, a hesitant but growing chorus. "Yes," someone shouted. "We can." The group started to gather, forming a line, each of us standing in front of our shadows. The dark-haired woman took the hand of a man beside her, and that gave me courage. I needed to do the same. "Remember," I said, trying to stay firm, "all this pain, all this guilt, this is what the deliverer feeds on. We need to confront our memories, not let them control us. He wants us to believe we are weak, that we are alone. But we are not." The shadows began to stir more intensively, and the deliverer advanced, his form becoming more defined, more threatening. "You cannot escape what you are," he said, his tone scornful. "You are just a failure. You always will be." But instead of backing down, I took a deep breath. Anger began to transform into determination. "I am not a failure," I declared, feeling the energy of the group around me. "I am a sum of my experiences, and each pain has brought me here. Together, we are stronger." With those words, something changed. The lights of the cafe shone brightly, and a wave of energy flowed between us. The deliverer hesitated, doubt beginning to infiltrate his posture. Seizing the opportunity, I shouted, "Let's confront our fears. Let's break the chains that bind us." And in an instant, we all began to share our stories. Each word was a step toward liberation, and the power of our collective began to manifest. The deliverer, now surrounded by our united voices, began to fade, his laughter transforming into screams of despair. But the struggle was not over. Doubt still lingered over me, and I knew that the true battle was just beginning. What would happen when the deliverer was finally defeated? Would we be able to face the consequences of our pasts? The answer was still shrouded in shadows, and the tension in the air was palpable. The lights began to flicker again, and I realized that the true challenge was not just to face the deliverer, but to confront what he represented within us. The fear, the guilt, the pain, everything we had tried to bury. And as the struggle intensified, I knew that whatever the outcome, we had to be ready to face not only the deliverer, but also the truth he would reveal. The atmosphere of the cafe became increasingly charged, as if each of our breaths was caught on a thin thread, about to snap. The delivery man, now an imposing shadow, approached, his presence pulsing with a negative energy that seemed to drain the light around us. I felt my heart race, and the voice that had once echoed inside me was now resonating in a frantic rhythm. What I had proposed seemed like an irreparable folly, and the reality of what we were about to face made everything even more oppressive. "Stay together," I shouted, trying to gather the courage that seemed to slip through my fingers. "We cannot let ourselves be divided." The weakness in my voice made me question my own determination, but the faces around me began to light up with a spark of hope. The dark-haired woman, whom I recognized as the strongest of all, took the hand of the man beside her, and that simple connection brought me a thread of encouragement. The delivery man advanced, his figure twisting in a grotesque dance that defied logic. "You cannot escape what you are," he hissed, his icy voice infiltrating my mind. "You are just a failure. You always will be." His words pierced me like sharp knives, and I almost succumbed to despair. But looking at the others, I realized they were also struggling. Each of them carried their own scars. Gathering all the bravery I could muster, I took a deep breath and said, "I am not a failure. I am a sum of my experiences, and every pain has brought me here. Together we are stronger." This assertion reverberated in the air, and I felt the energy of the group begin to flow between us, like an electric current. The delivery man hesitated, his expression shifting from disdain to something resembling fear. Seizing the opportunity, I shouted, "Let's confront our fears. Let's break the chains that bind us." And so, we began to share our stories, each word a declaration of resistance. The power of our collective began to manifest, and the delivery man, once so threatening, started to fade, his cruel laughter turning into screams of despair. But the fight was not over yet. Doubt lingered in my heart, and I knew that the true battle was not just against the delivery man, but against what he represented within us. The fear, the guilt, the pain, everything we had tried to bury. The tension in the air was palpable, and the lights in the cafe began to flicker again, as if reflecting the internal struggle we faced. "Remember what you have lost," the delivery man growled, his voice echoing like thunder. Remember what you will never be. His words became an echo in my mind, a painful reminder of what I had left behind. But instead of retreating, I faced the void that his words created. Anger and pain began to transform into something more powerful. "We are not what you say we are," I shouted, feeling the strength of the group around me. "We are not defined by our failures. We are the sum of our experiences, and that makes us stronger." The united voices of all of us began to create a crescendo, a wave of energy manifesting against the figure of the delivery man. He began to rise, his form fading under the force of our determination. "You cannot control us," someone shouted, and the strength of the group intensified. I saw the faces of my companions light up with renewed determination. We felt that, together, we were unstoppable. Each of us connected to a greater force, a light shining through the shadows the delivery man tried to create. "Let's go. Let's confront this," I urged, the urgency in my voice growing. The shadows began to stir more violently, and the delivery man advanced with renewed fury, his figure becoming more menacing. But instead of retreating, we moved forward, each of us firmly holding the hand of the other, united in our struggle. "Remember your stories," I shouted, and as each of us began to recall our pains, our struggles, and our victories, the atmosphere around us began to change. The delivery man was no longer a terrifying being, but a shadow feeding off our fear. And as we shared our truths, he began to fade even more, his words becoming weaker and weaker. The battle was both physical and emotional. I could feel the energy of the group pulsating, and the strength of our stories became an armor against the terror. "Together, we are more than the sum of our parts," I declared, and the cafe began to vibrate with the strength of our unity. But suddenly, the delivery man made a sudden move, and a cold silence fell over us. "Do you really think you can defeat me?" he growled, his voice now a distorted echo. "All your effort will be in vain. You will always be defined by your failures, by your bad choices." And as he spoke, a wave of negative energy spread, trying to divide us again. I felt doubt seep into my heart, but instead of succumbing, I remembered the words of everyone by my side. "We are not defined by our failures," I shouted, my voice echoing in the air. "We are more than that. Together we can face anything." With that, I moved toward the delivery man, surrounded by the collective energy of our group. I was no longer just me. We were all of us, uniting our strengths in one last effort. The lights of the cafe began to shine brightly, and the delivery man began to dissolve, his dark form dissipating like mist in the sun. With a final cry of determination, I launched my energy at him, and in an instant, the figure of the delivery man shattered in an explosion of light and shadows. The cafe trembled, and I fell to my knees, exhausted but relieved. The weight I had felt began to dissipate, as if the air around us was being purified. What remained was a profound silence, but not a silence of pain. It was a silence of liberation. I looked around and saw the faces of my companions, now illuminated by a new light. Each of them had faced their own demons, and together we defeated them. The delivery man had been merely a reflection of what we carried in our hearts, and by confronting him, we found the strength we did not know we had. But deep down, I knew that this battle was just the beginning. The truth that the delivery man had revealed still weighed upon us, and the path ahead would be filled with challenges. However, now we were together, and this connection, this collective strength, was the key to facing what was to come. The fight was not over, but instead of fear, I felt hope. And for the first time, the light seemed to shine brighter than the shadows that sought to consume us. The silence that followed the explosion of light was almost deafening. I was on my knees, my body weary and my mind confused, but a feeling of relief wrapped around me like a warm blanket. The deliverer, the shadow that had tormented us, was now nothing more than a distant echo, a memory that was beginning to fade. But what I did not expect was the wave of emotions that hit me hard. The emotional scars I carried, which I had tried to ignore for so long, now became as visible and present as the physical marks left by the experience. The pain of every loss, of every failure, resurfaced, and I realized that, although we had defeated the Deliverer, the consequences of our confrontation were far from resolved. I looked around, and the faces of my companions reflected the same internal struggle. That victory came at a price, and each of us paid with a part of our soul. As we began to rise, the reality of what we had faced settled in me. The cafe, which had once been a place of comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of memories and whispers. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows danced to an unsettling rhythm. I knew that even though I had survived, something had changed within me. The experiences we shared in that moment of unity left me marked. I was no longer the same person who had walked in there. That night, as I returned home, each step I took seemed to echo in my mind as a reminder of what had happened. The streets, once familiar, now transformed into a dark backdrop. The wind whispered secrets I did not want to hear. Every corner seemed to hide another memory of what we had faced. The Deliverer had been defeated, but his words still echoed in my mind, like a dark mantra I could not ignore. My dreams became a battlefield. The nights were filled with visions of the Deliverer, his distorted and threatening figure emerging from the shadows. I would wake up gasping, my heart racing, and even though I knew it was just a nightmare, the feeling of terror lingered. The emotional scars left by the experience manifested as anxiety and insecurity, as if I were perpetually on the edge of an abyss. As days passed, I realized that others also carried their own marks. The man beside the dark-haired woman seemed distant, lost in thought. I remembered his stories, the pain he had shared. The woman, in turn, tried to maintain a facade of strength, but her gaze was empty, as if life had drained her. We were survivors, but the internal battle each of us had faced was far from over. The mystery that had brought us together was resolved, but each of us had become a little more broken. The conversations that once flowed easily were now laden with uncomfortable silences. The cafe, which had once been a refuge, was now a constant reminder that fear and pain could hide in the simplest things. I realized I would never see the world the same way again. And so, the days passed, and time dragged on. I became a spectator of my own life, observing the interactions around me as if I were in a movie. The laughter of friends, the routine of daily life, all felt distant, as if I were trapped in a bubble of isolation. The feeling that evil could be lurking even in the most mundane things never left me. The Deliverer had been defeated, but the nightmare was not over. I knew I needed to face this. Talking to others, sharing what had happened, was a way to try to find some sense in the chaos that had settled in my emotions. I organized a meeting with those who had fought by my side. When everyone gathered, a heavy silence hung over us. It was then that, one by one, we began to share the consequences of the experience. The stories surfaced like an uncontrollable flood. Tears were shed, nervous laughter echoed, and the pain finally found an outlet. However, even amidst the cathartic sharing, there was an empty space, a mystery that continued to haunt us. What had the Deliverer truly been? Was he merely a manifestation of our fear, or was there something deeper and darker behind his presence? The answers remained elusive, but at least we found some comfort in each other's company. What I realized by the end of that night was that the real struggle was the one we fought within ourselves, and that the scars we carried were not marks of weakness, but of resilience. The Deliverer may have been quelled, but what he left behind in us was a constant reminder that, even in the shadows, light could still shine. And so, looking to the future, I knew the path ahead would be filled with challenges. The The fight against fear and pain would never completely end. But now, I was no longer alone. Together, we could face the shadows that still haunted us, and perhaps one day, find the peace we so desperately sought. The weight of that night was still within me, an anchor pulling me down as I tried to navigate the turbulent waters of everyday life. I had faced a monster, a deliverer that fed on our fears and insecurities. But upon defeating it, I realized that the true confrontation was just beginning. In the external struggle, we had found a form of unity, a bond that connected us. But the internal battle was a solitary journey, filled with questions and insecurities. What did it really mean to win? There were moments when I wondered if victory was just an illusion, a brief moment of light amid a sea of darkness. Each memory of that night, each fragment of pain and struggle, seemed to remind me that peace was not a destination, but a path I had to walk every day. I looked at the faces of my companions and saw that, although we were together, each of us faced personal demons that were invisible to the eyes of others. As I reflected on this, I realized that the deliverer was not just a dark figure from a nightmare. He was a representation of everything I had repressed, a personification of my own insecurities and fears. The night I faced him had become a rite of passage, a milestone where I not only challenged something external, but also confronted the darkness within me. And that was frightening. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. I knew I could no longer hide behind the walls I had built over the years. Each emotional scar I carried was now a visible reminder of what I had overcome. And instead of being ashamed of them, I began to embrace them as part of my story. After all, each of us carries our own marks, and it is through them that we find strength and resilience. The meeting with my companions was a crucial step. As we shared our stories, we realized we were not alone. There was immense power in vulnerability, a strength that came from honesty and authenticity. What had once been an unbearable weight became a shared burden, and the words exchanged in that dark room served as a balm for the wounds that still bled. I remembered how, in a moment of pain, we nervously laughed, as if laughter were a shield against sadness. Those moments of relief brought us even closer and made me realize there was beauty in the struggle. Each of us had a story, and each story was a piece of the puzzle that formed our collective experience. The deliverer had tried to divide us, but in reality, he united us in a way we could never have imagined. Of course, the feeling of loss was still present. The scars left by the battle would not disappear overnight. There were days when I woke up, and the memory of what I had faced suffocated me. But at the same time, there was a new understanding, a new perspective on life and on myself. I was no longer the person who had walked into that cafe, and that metamorphosis was ultimately a gift that the deliverer had left me. As time passed, I realized that true courage was not in eliminating fear, but in facing it. Life is not about the absence of pain, but about how we deal with it, how we find meaning in the most challenging experiences. What I had learned is that each of us has an unshakable strength within us, even when shadows threaten to engulf us. As I prepared for what would come next, I knew that the questions arising in my mind did not have easy answers. What had the deliverer been? Was he merely a manifestation of my fear or something more? These reflections did not matter, for what truly mattered was the journey of self-discovery I was experiencing. I was learning to embrace uncertainty, to find beauty in vulnerability, and to accept that life is a mosaic of light and shadow. And so, as I looked to the future, carrying the scars that I now saw as marks of resilience, I knew I was not alone. With each step I took, I felt that light could shine even in the darkest parts. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with possibilities. And, most importantly, I had found a purpose. Not just to survive, but to live fully, even amid uncertainty. The deliverer may have been defeated, but his presence taught me to fight for myself and to cherish every moment of light that came my way. I looked out the window as night fell, the darkness wrapping around my house like a familiar cloak. There was an unsettling silence in the air, a calm that preceded something I couldn't identify. The feeling that the delivery man, even defeated, had not truly disappeared began to consume me. He had become a part of me, a shadow lurking at the edges of my consciousness, always ready to emerge when I least expected it. In the following weeks, meetings with my companions became a ritual. Together, we shared stories, laughter, and tears. But there was a tension in the air, a foreboding that the battle was not over. Sometimes, in moments of silence, I could feel a chill that didn't belong to the temperature of the room. It was a reminder that the delivery man might be closer than we imagined. One night, upon returning home, I found an envelope at my door. The paper was yellowed and worn, as if it had been kept for a long time. Inside, there was a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. "You may have won the battle, but the war never ends." My heart raced, and a wave of dread washed over me. The feeling that he was always present, watching my every move, left me restless. As the days went by, things began to happen. Objects moved on their own. Whispers became frequent, and disturbing dreams invaded my sleep. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I felt his presence, as if he were watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I was not only fighting my fears, I was battling something that felt more real than any imagination could conjure. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard a noise coming from the hallway. My heart raced, and hesitantly, I went to the door. Upon opening it, I found a shadow, an indistinct figure writhing on the walls. It was him. The delivery man had returned, not in physical form, but as a presence that fed off my fear and uncertainty. His laughter echoed through the house, a grotesque sound that paralyzed me. I knew I needed to confront this, but the idea of facing him again filled me with terror. The battle I thought I had won was far from resolved. The external struggle had merely been a prelude to the true battle unfolding within me. The victory I had felt was an illusion, a mask that was now unraveling. Desperate, I went to the meeting with my companions. I explained what was happening, and with every word that left my mouth, I realized they were also fighting their own darkness. The battle was not just mine, it was a collective struggle. But at the same time, sharing didn't seem to be enough. The delivery man had become an intrinsic part of my life, a parasite feeding on my pain. That night, as I returned home, the feeling that he was lurking increased. The wind howled outside the window, and a thick fog covered the streets. I knew I had to face what he represented. It was time to confront not just the delivery man, but everything he symbolized. With renewed determination, I prepared for the final battle. When night fell, I called him. What I didn't know was that this decision would have terrible consequences. The air grew heavy, and the environment around me began to distort. A dark laugh echoed in response to my call, and I realized, horrified, that the delivery man had manifested in a more grotesque form. He was not just a delivery man. He was an entity that fed on everything I had lost, on every fear I carried within me. As I tried to defend myself, I realized there was no escaping. He was a part of me, and the battle I thought I could win was lost before it even began. Darkness enveloped him, and I understood that by defeating him, I had only freed him. What had once been a monster was now an eternal shadow in my life. The light inside me began to fade, and with it, a sense of despair took over. He may have been defeated once, but now he was free, and I was trapped in an endless cycle of fear and loneliness. The victory I had longed for turned into a nightmare, and in a final moment of clarity, I understood. The true terror does not lie in external monsters, but in the darkness we carry within ourselves. And so, I found myself in a labyrinth of shadows, where the delivery man would never cease to haunt me. Now he was part of my life, a constant presence I could not ignore. The fight was over, but the terror persisted, a constant reminder that darkness never truly disappears. Now, as I reflect on this, I invite you to share your own experiences. Have you ever faced an internal battle? Have you felt the weight of darkness? Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe here for more stories that explore the complexity of the human struggle. Remember, the true fight can be more terrifying than any monster we can imagine.